please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Darcy Maulsby. Well, thank you. It's so good to see so many friendly faces in the audience. And truly, like Jane said, if you need to get up and get a cookie, it's okay with me, because if I were giving my Culinary History of Iowa program, I would say we Iowans don't meet unless we eat. So we're here to talk about Titanic today, and like you mentioned, Jane, the kids are fascinated by this story, adults are fascinated by this story. I mean, all you have to do is say Titanic, and the number of people that come to these programs goes through the roof because everybody is fascinated with the Titanic. What you don't always realize is how many Iowa ties there were to the Titanic. Now, I was aware of little snippets of these stories, but what really fueled me going on this deep dive into the research was a tea party in Iowa City in 2017. The Johnson County Historical Society had a Tea on the Titanic event with an author who had written a book about Swedes on the Titanic. And here it turns out that there were all these really interesting stories about Swedes and Iowa that I didn't know related to the Titanic. So that piqued my interest. And I wrote a blog post about these things, and then I just kept digging because there was more to find. And then suddenly you think, okay, I've got enough material here, I need to put this together in a book. And I want you to remember the name Frances Marie Lefebvre. That was my boarding pass. Have any of you ever been to one of these events where it's a tea party or a museum exhibit and you get a boarding pass and you're actually assuming the identity of a Titanic passenger and you find out at the end whether you lived or died? So we'll find out what happened to Frances, because believe it or not, there was an Iowa tie here. How many of you recall when Titanic was found, September 1, 1985? It made headlines all around the world. I was in about 5th grade at the time. I thought it was the coolest thing I had ever heard. And there's Dr. Robert Ballard down in the right-hand corner. He was the gentleman who found Titanic. At one point I thought, maybe I want to be a marine explorer because this is really cool, but then I decided a kid coming from Iowa, that's probably not the most logical career choice. But anyway, Dr. Ballard, what they couldn't tell you in 1985, Dr. Ballard was not down there just to find Titanic. He was on a mission with the U.S. Navy, so they were footing the bill for this exploration. They were trying to find 2 nuclear subs that disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the 1960s, the Scorpion and the Thresher. So he did find both subs during the time he was exploring the North Atlantic. And the Navy wanted to know, were these things still leaking nuclear radiation, or had they leaked radiation? It turns out they had not. But the real kicker here is that he learned how to read what are called debris trails. So when a ship sinks, just like with Titanic, which broke in 2, the contents spill out. And then depending on how ocean currents work and how that ship body sinks to the floor of the ocean, you will have these debris trails that form somewhat predictable patterns. He learned to read the debris trails by hunting down the Scorpion and the Thresher. That's what finally led them to Titanic. And remember, it took 73 years to find Titanic from the time she sank. Part of it was that we just didn't have good enough technology to go down that deep. She's down 2.5 miles in the ocean. It takes you over 2 hours just to get there today in a submersible. You would die immediately if your submersible failed at those kinds of levels. Ballard didn't have much time to find the Titanic either. The Navy didn't give him unlimited time to be at the bottom of the ocean. And so he had about 12 days left, and he was able to find her. So let's go back to that world of 1912. One of the things that I always try and impress upon audiences, we look at all this through 2022 eyes. 1912 was in some ways a similar place to 2022 Iowa, but sometimes it was vastly different. And there were a lot of great things that happened in 1912. Oreos were invented. Actually, lifesavers were invented in 1912. You could mail a letter for 2 cents. And actually the coldest spot in Iowa, and that record still stands, was set in January of 1912 in a little town called Washita up in the Cherokee area. It got to minus 47, very cold. And also in 1912, women did not yet have the right to vote in national elections. I always find this little thing here from the Farm Bureau a little bit curious. Women's suffrage means high taxes. Oh! Whatever. So Titanic herself was a modern marvel in 1912. That's part of why she was attracting so much attention even at the time. There was nothing bigger or more technologically advanced than Titanic. And you think about, we're not that far removed from the era of sailing ships, where you actually had to have sails and you had to depend on the wind to get you across the Atlantic. And in the days of the sailing ship, where you totally depend on Mother Nature, it might take up to 6 weeks or more to make that crossing from Europe to America. And if a storm hit, or you got blown off course and you didn't arrive on time, no one knew what had happened to you. So it was quite an uncertain, unsteady process at times. By the 1890s, we're really seeing the transition to more of these coal-fired boilers that would power modern ships. Although a lot of these ships, even as late as the 1890s, still had the auxiliary rigging, so we could put up the sails if we need to. And what this leads to, when you have the modern technology, is you can reach this long-harbored dream of no longer does it take 3 to 4 to 6 weeks to make that crossing. We can do it in a week, and we can do it consistently. And there's a lot of money to be made from this, and so there were all kinds of shipping companies all over the world that wanted to get in the shipping business and transport passengers. White Star Line was the one that was Titanic's flagship company. There were others like Cunard and others in other countries, but they competed fiercely for this transatlantic shipment business because moving immigrants from Europe to America was a very profitable business. And actually, people think they made all their money on the rich first-class passengers. They did not. They made the bulk of their profits on the third class, simply because there were so many more of those folks than the wealthy that would travel in first class. The other thing that was just setting the world on fire at this time, and was one of the reasons that Titanic was called the practically unsinkable ship, well, even if she got in trouble, I mean, she's this beast of a ship that is so solidly built, but if something went terribly awry, don't panic, we have Marconi wireless on board. So finally, for one of the first times in history, we can call to other ships. We can call ship to shore if we're close enough. So we're not out here by ourselves. Someone will be able to hear our distress call. It's going to be okay. It'll be fine. We're the practically unsinkable ship. So on the day, this was her last day to live, April 14th, 1912. Remember, this is her maiden voyage. We had about 2,200 people on board. She could hold 3,500. She was not at capacity, but still 2,200 is a sizable amount. Now, we're okay on life jackets, about 3,500 life jackets, 20 lifeboats with a capacity of 1,178. Do you see a problem? And you ask, well, why would they do such a foolish thing? Well, actually, they had more lifeboat capacity available on Titanic than was required by maritime law at the time. And they wanted more deck space so the first-class passengers didn't have to mess around getting around these lifeboats. You'd have more promenade space, and that appealed to passengers. That helped you sell tickets. And plus, she's practically unsinkable, so who cares about lifeboats? We're not actually going to have to use them. They didn't even do any drills or anything, no safety drills. So it's definitely a case where maybe we were getting a little bit arrogant about human technology and how we're smarter than Mother Nature. But she was a beast. She was 4 city blocks long. Just imagine that, taking 4 blocks of Lincoln Way here. That's how long she was, about 11 stories high. And essentially, she was the largest man-made moving object on the planet in 1912. Now, these numbers, I've seen different dollar figures on these, but this will give you a rough estimate of how our dollars equate to the ticket price to go on Titanic. Third class was about $300 to $800. It wasn't chump change, but for some people, it was their life savings. Some people in third class actually could have afforded to do second class, but they just wanted to be frugal so they'd have more money to spend when they got where they were going. Second class would have been more of your business travelers, so there were some ministers and other professional people in this class. That was about $1,200 a ticket. And the first class tickets ranged all the way from a low-grade $3,000 ticket to $83,000 for the best suite on the ship. The uber rich were, I mean, the class structure here, the wealth of some of these people was unimaginable. I've often said we'll never see a time like this again in human history, I don't think, because today the uber rich have their own yachts, they have their own airplanes. They don't ride in the same methods that those of us here in the cheap seats do. But at that time there was only one way to cross the ocean, and that was a liner, just like Titanic. Now, most Titanic stories talk about the rich and famous, not people from Iowa. And there were some interesting characters, no doubt, on board. We had pro athletes. We had Carl Bear, who was a tennis star. There were actually 2 professional tennis players on board. Carl was chasing his girlfriend, Helen Newsom. He went to Europe to find her because her parents didn't like Carl. And they kind of took her away to just maybe think, well, she'll forget about that Carl guy if we take her on the grand tour of Europe. Well, then Carl shows up in Europe and they reconnect on Titanic. They both survived Titanic. And all these weird little stories. Carl Bear would go on to play a tennis match against the other pro tennis player who was on Titanic, who also survived. This is when they were back in the States, obviously. Dorothy Gibson in the middle there, she was a silent film star. She was traveling first class. She too survived, and within a month of the sinking, she had made a film about the sinking of Titanic, and her wardrobe was the same dress she wore the night the ship sank. Wow. Now, one of the first class passengers that you will meet today from Iowa, she might have been very excited that Lady Duff Gordon was on board. That is a British gal, and she was a famous fashion designer at the time. And so to be seen in a Lady Duff, her brand name was Lucille, but to have a Lucille gown would have been very desirable if you were traveling first class. Because you got to remember, these first class ladies did not show up with a backpack or even just a suitcase. They had maids who traveled with them. They had, a lot of times, anywhere from 12 to 20 trunks of clothes. And you would change clothes constantly throughout the voyage because you had to be seen at all these dinner parties and whatnot, and you had to be able to flaunt your wealth. So there's that. And talk about wealth. Basically, the richest man on earth was on the ship, John Jacob Astor IV. Now, you may notice that there's a little bit of age difference here. He was 47, his wife was 18. This was a second marriage for him, and he was divorced, and that was quite scandalous in 1912. And so essentially, he and Madeline had left New York City to get away from all the gossip mongers that were just chattering incessantly about how scandalous it was that he remarried after this divorce and married someone so young. And Madeline was pregnant when she was on the ship, and the sad story is, it's not sad, she survived and then gave birth to a baby in August of that year, but he did not survive. So, Ben Guggenheim, has anybody ever heard of the Guggenheim Museum in New York? Been there, great, cool building. So Guggenheim was the heir of a very wealthy, well-to-do family that helped found the Guggenheim Museum. He was a little bit naughty, apparently, because he was married, but he was not traveling on Titanic with his wife. He was traveling with his mistress, which actually was very common when you dig into some of the records. There were all kinds of people using fake names and traveling with people they really shouldn't have been with. Just like a little scandalous microcosm of society here on Titanic. Some people behaved with more decorum. Isidore and Ida Strauss, if you've ever heard of Macy's department store, they were co-owners of Macy's. And if you've seen the 1997 movie Titanic, there's the older couple that says, I'm not leaving the ship, I'm not getting in the light. If he can't go, I'm not going, as the wife says. That is the Strausses in that movie. There were dogs on Titanic. When you're rich, you travel with your dogs. So a lot of first class people had their dogs. They were scheduled to have a dog show on board on Monday, April 15th. That obviously did not happen. So even folks like the Astors, who had an Airedale that they were traveling with, a dog named Kitty, of all things, even dogs like Kitty did not survive the sinking, although there were a few little dogs that did manage to get into lifeboats and were safe. So let's talk about Iowa. It's really quite amazing that there's about at least a dozen people I have identified that have ties to Iowa and Titanic. And you can see they represent a whole cross-section, first, second, and third class, and everything from basically a criminal, a kidnapper, to a missionary. So we've got the whole spectrum of human behavior here. So I will tell you a few of their stories. But let's get our bearings first. So April 15th, this was a very, let's start on April 14th, because this iceberg impact happens at 11:40 on a Sunday night. It had been very clear, extremely clear. Nothing but glittering stars in the sky. They said the sea was as smooth as glass. But they hit this iceberg in the North Atlantic after being at sea for about 4 days at this point on the maiden voyage. And people always ask, well, did people on board know that they had hit this iceberg? Depends on where you were in the ship. If you're down in third class, because that's where the impact happened, was low on the ship, they knew right away something bad had happened. Second class, you probably felt some type of a bump, and it was odd, but you didn't know exactly what had happened. If you're up at the top of the ship, in the middle, in some of these first class suites, you maybe didn't even know there had been an impact. And remember, it's 11:40 at night on Sunday. A lot of people had gone to bed at this point. Although there were still a few party dogs in some of the saloons that were still playing cards and drinking whiskey. But 2 hours and 40 minutes later after impact, the ship was gone. And some people say, oh my gosh, you can look at this two ways. You can either say that happened really fast or that happened really slow. In some ways, if you argue it happened really slow, you have a case, because when Lusitania was blasted a few years later during World War I, she went to the bottom in 20 minutes. And so when you have 2 hours and 40 minutes, it did give you some time to try and evacuate this ship. But we'll talk about why so many people did not get evacuated from this sinking ship. And you can call this fake news, but there was, just like now, there's always this race to be first rather than be accurate. And so that's the Des Moines Evening Tribune. And notice the headline, Monster Liner's passengers are all rescued. Wireless messages are once more effective in the saving of lives. So obviously they were a little bit off the mark there. And a little pop quiz for you. Do you know what eventually, the shocking Iowa event that eventually pushed Titanic out of the headlines in 1912?
Axe murders in Melissa.
Very good. Those came along June 10th, 1912. So 1912 was a very distressing year in Iowa. So let's talk about the kidnapper. He was actually a Frenchman named Michel Navratil Sr. There he is on the left. His wife Marcel is there on the right. And they've been having marital problems. And they were basically headed towards a divorce, and they were having all these custody disputes, and they had two cute little young boys. And so right before Easter 1912, the kids had been with their father, and they were supposed to come back to Marcel. Well, that didn't happen because Daddy decided to kidnap the boys, and he gave everybody an assumed name. So he became Louis Hoffman, and the boys became Lolo and Momon. Interesting choices for fake names. And they get on Titanic. And he passes himself off as a widower who is coming to America to start a new life with his boys. And the Iowa connection comes in with this Bertha Lehman, who was a Swiss girl, age 17, who was headed to eastern Iowa to a town called Central City to reconnect with some family who had already immigrated to America. And the reason those two groups got connected is because, remember, the Navratils are French, and so they speak French on an English ship. If you're going to connect with other people, you need someone that speaks your language. And Daddy sometimes wanted to get away from these kids, and he needed a babysitter so he could go to the saloon and do what guys do and have the kids be looked after. And so Bertha had been seasick most of the journey, but she did come out towards the end before the sinking, about the day of or the day before. And they met at the dinner table, and they started chatting, and he thought, well, she could babysit my kids. And so that's the connection of how they came to be together. And the night of the sinking, the boys did get put into a lifeboat, and sadly their father did not survive. Let's talk about Bertha. I guess I kind of jumped ahead and told you a lot of her story already. But she had no idea when she was interacting with this father and two sons that the guy was being dishonest, and he was not Mr. Hoffman, and he was not a widower. So there's the two little dudes, Edmund and Michelle Jr. Cute, aren't they? Now, when the rescue ship Carpathia brings these kids with the other survivors to New York, these kids are kind of a challenge because they speak French. We didn't have people here at the docks that could speak French. No one's claiming these children. And so the natural assumption is, well, obviously they're orphans, which they kind of were, but they kind of weren't, because if you knew the backstory, which no one did, they still had a mother in France. So essentially the equivalent of the Associated Press took a picture of these two adorable little Titanic waifs, they called them, and it gets put on the wire service, and it gets printed in newspapers all over the world. And guess who sees the picture? Marcel. And she says, those kids aren't orphans, those are my children. I can't imagine what she had been going through from the time they didn't get returned from their father, and then she sees their picture as Titanic survivors. So she had to get on a ship and come to America to claim her children. I think it'd be a little nerve-wracking to have to get on a ship after what had just happened, but she had no other choice. It was a ship or nothing. And of course she wanted to be reunited with the kids. So they went back to France. Both boys had very good lives. The one did serve in World War II and had some injuries and some challenges, and died not all that long after that, unfortunately. But the other one went on and I believe became a college professor, and he was actually one of the last male survivors of the Titanic by the time he died. So what happened to Bertha? Bertha did survive. She made it to Central City. You know, the little twist there is that she was supposed to come in May of 1912 to Iowa, but she had the chance to go early, and she thought, oh my gosh, my ship has come in, right? I get to be on Titanic, the biggest, most fabulous ship in the world, and I'll get to surprise my family. Well, I'm sure her family was surprised when they heard all the backstory here. I find it curious that she married in 1913. This seems like a pretty fast situation happening after her coming through all this trauma, coming to a new country. But it wasn't that uncommon to see stuff like this happening with some of the survivors. My guess is that honestly these people had what we would call PTSD today, but nobody called it that then, and nobody wanted to talk about it, because you're just supposed to shut your mouth, don't whine about things, get on with life. And I'm sure some of these people struggled mightily with some mental health issues. Why, the survivor's guilt, why me? So sadly, this marriage didn't last. They did have a child the next year in 1914. The marriage is pretty much falling apart by 1917. The husband served in World War I and had some pretty serious injuries there. He dies in 1918. So sad deal, but she does get remarried to a nice gentleman named Carl Lewers. They lived in Minnesota and the Dakotas, and they had some more children. So you can see in the picture, there she is with Carl and Elmer from her first marriage, and then the children they had together with Carl. But she did go back to Europe a number of times, which I find interesting too. Some people would never set foot on another ship or airplane to go back, but she still had family in Europe, and that's a picture of her down below with her sister on one of those trips back to Europe. So she did have a good life, and she died in 1967. So there's Frances. Remember I told you, remember Frances. There's my boarding pass from that Iowa City event. And I looked at it and I thought, well, you know, she at that time is pretty close to my age. She's from France. Oh, look at where she's headed to. Mystic, Iowa. Ooh, where's Mystic? It's way down in southeast Iowa, down south of Centerville. And this is coal mining country in 1912. People don't realize how big coal mining was in parts of Iowa. Even close to here, you get into Dallas County, you get down by Perry, Angus, Woodward, those areas, into Des Moines and beyond. Tons of coal mining, because that's how we heated our homes and businesses. Ships like Titanic ran on coal. It was huge. And so her husband and some of her older children, older sons, were already in Mystic, Iowa, working in these coal mines. And so that's why she was headed there with a whole bunch of the younger kids, 4 of the youngest kids. Now, she thinks they're going to have this great family reunion, but it turns out her husband Frank, who was here in Mystic already, he'd been getting a little naughty on the side too, because he had this common law wife that he claimed too, you know, I'm a single guy, and he meets this gal in Iowa who's also French, and they become a common law man and wife essentially. What happens is that Francis and these 4 younger children, they do not survive Titanic. They were traveling 3rd class. They did not survive. And so Frank here in Iowa sees these headlines of Titanic sinking. He sees the picture of those Navratil kids, and his scheming mind starts thinking, well, those could be my kids. I haven't seen them for a long time, you know. They're French kids. Because maybe I could sue the White Star Line and make some money in the process and get my kids back. And, you know, this is just how some of these criminal-minded people think. But that was actually a really bad move for him to make his presence known by raising a stink and trying to get some money out of this deal, because then it turns out that the feds got onto him and figured out he was not really a legitimate citizen. And they find out about this common law wife who is also not here legitimately. So last I could find of their story in the Centerville newspaper about July 1912, they were deported back to France. And that's all I can tell you about that. Now, some people behaved much better on Titanic. This picture here looks like a kind of crummy, low-grade picture, but the reason it's so significant is because this family does have an Iowa tie. That's not why the picture is significant, but the picture is them on Titanic before it left England. See, when Titanic was picking up passengers on that maiden voyage, first it stopped in Southampton, England, which is south of London. Then it went over to Cherbourg, France, and picked up more passengers. That's where a lot of our first-class rich people get on. Then it comes back and goes to Cobh, England, which at the time was known as Queenstown. That's where a lot of your 3rd-class Irish immigrants get on board. And then it takes off for America. But in those days, I mean, think about now. You can't just, if you're going to the airport to see your loved ones get on a flight, you can't get past all the security and just go right up to the boarding gate like your family can who's traveling. But in those days, the rules were pretty loose. And so this family here, the Caldwell family, had their friends come on board, and the friend actually had a camera, which was kind of rare in 1912. So we had a photography buff here, and thank goodness the friend was not traveling, because you can imagine, you could take every picture, but if you were on Titanic, guess where your camera went? To the bottom of the sea, right? So because this friend was not on Titanic, that's why we still have this very rare picture of the family on the deck of the Titanic. So let's talk about the Caldwells a little bit. So Albert Caldwell, the father, he was a Christian missionary. He was born up in Sanborn, Iowa, northwest Iowa, if anybody knows where Sanborn is. And in those days, just like now, ministers move around a lot. His father was a minister. And so their next trip, or next location, was down in Allerton, which isn't too far from Mystic, actually, so way down in southern Iowa. And he was a college man here, Albert was. After high school, he got to go to a place called Park College, which is still in existence today. It's northwest of Kansas City. And actually he met his wife there, which I find that really interesting because very few women were going to college in 1912. They were barely getting past 8th grade most of the time. But his wife, Sylvia, was also a student at Park. So they meet, they marry, they decide they're going to become Christian missionaries after graduation, and they set sail for the Far East, and they end up in Siam, which is now known as Thailand. They had their first child over there. So that's the baby in the picture. That's little Alden, who was born in Asia. You know, life was really good for the young couple over there until she has this baby, because she had just a whole litany of health problems after giving birth to this child, and she never felt very well after that. And so the Caldwells decided they were going to break their contract, even though the church was most unhappy about this. They said, I'm really sorry, but we've got to come back to the States because Sylvia is just literally dying here in Asia. So they decided to start working their way back. You know, it was a real process. If you're that far from the Midwest, that is a major undertaking to get back to the States. So they had all these legs of the journey. They got to Naples, Italy, where they thought maybe they could rest for a little bit before they carry on, but there was a cholera outbreak there. So if you have an ill wife and a young baby, you don't want to be where there's cholera. So this is when they first hear about Titanic. And they think, oh, hallelujah, this is the answer to our prayers. The biggest ship in the world, it'll be the most comfortable, smooth sailing. Sylvia won't get seasick, what a blessing. So by the time they get to London, Albert rushes up to the ticket office. I need a ticket for Titanic. And they find out that the ticket that he wanted was sold out. Now we know Titanic wasn't full, but whatever specific ticket he wanted, it was sold out. But you know, just like today, they might tell you, well, come back tomorrow, maybe we'll have something. So he comes back, and here, sure enough, they had a ticket for the whole family. And he thought once again, oh, this is great, this is fabulous, we're going to be on Titanic. So they survived, that's the good news. And the deal about being a man and surviving Titanic, it's not as glorious as you'd think, because for the rest of most of these men's days, when people would find out they were on Titanic, the next question was, what kind of coward were you when all those women and children died? What'd you do, jump in a lifeboat and steal a seat from the women and the kids? But Albert could always say truthfully, I had to, because my wife was so sick, she couldn't even hold our infant son. I had to go. And so that was, they're a rare Titanic family. That's the name of the book that was written by Albert's great niece, who I'm friends with on with Facebook. I've talked to her about the family. She's great. But anyway, they're rare because so few families survived that sinking intact. Hardly any of them didn't lose somebody in the sinking. So what happens to the Caldwells? They do get back to the Midwest. They did come back to Iowa too, so not too far from here. They lived in Ames for a time, where Albert was the principal of Ames High School for about 3 years. Now, sadly, this divorce in 1930, I think this probably, who knows why it really happened, but I gotta believe that all the heartache and mental health issues connected to Titanic probably played a role in this somehow. But don't worry about the Caldwells. Sylvia did very well for herself the second time around. She married the president of State Farm Insurance Company. And then Albert also married a very nice lady, and they had both of them had good lives. Now, ironically, baby Alden, when he grew up, he hated talking about the Titanic. Because for one thing, he was too young to remember any of this, and he just got annoyed by it. Like, you know, I've done nothing else in my life worth talking about. All you people on the anniversary of this, all you want to do is talk about that stupid old ship. So he never liked to talk about it. His parents did, though. So you find there's two types of people. Some survivors always were happy to talk to the media, and some people, like the gal we'll meet next, they just never, ever told their story till maybe at the end of their life. So if you know anything about orphan trains, you know that there were these kids that were put on trains and sent to the Midwest, kids that were orphaned in big cities like New York and Boston, and the theory being if we could get them out of these awful cities, and they were awful, especially for orphan kids, if we could get them out here to small towns and farms and get them adopted, at least they've got a shot at life. And this gal named Helen Delaney was a bona fide orphan after Titanic. I couldn't find much of anything about her family's history. They appear to be British, but anyway, they get on Titanic. What I could find is that little Helen, who's only 4 years old at the time Titanic sinks, basically she gets thrown into a lifeboat, which was not that uncommon. Towards the end, when everything was really out of control on that ship, people were jumping long ways to get into lifeboats. They were breaking their arms and ribs. Babies were being chucked into these lifeboats. It must have been a god-awful scene. But she makes it into the boat. She ends up in one of these orphanages in New York, and she gets put on an orphan train and makes it to Council Bluffs. And she does get adopted by the Delaney family. And she had a good life. She never married, but she stayed in Council Bluffs her whole life. She worked at Kresge's, if any of you remember Kresge's, which was the forerunner of Kmart, basically the big box stores we know today. She was a clerk there, never talked about Titanic. And the only thing I could find was about one newspaper article that it says she did talk about it to her doctor finally at the very end of her life. So she died at age 74 in 1982 and is buried in Council Bluffs. Now back to that Iowa City Tea Party in 2017, I mentioned an author who talked about Swedes on the Titanic. What was fantastic about her book, it's called Not My Time to Die. She herself is Swedish, so she can speak Swedish, and she could translate a lot of those old letters that nobody had bothered to translate before, ones that were from Titanic survivors that talked about what went on that night on the ship. And she translates these letters, puts them in this book, Not My Time to Die. And one of these letters was from a gal named Dagmar Breil, who was a young engaged woman coming over to America. She was actually headed to Red Oak in southwest Iowa with her brother and her fiance. They were going to start a new life. And they were going to stop actually in the Chicago area as a first stop to visit some relatives before coming to Red Oak. But then the sinking happens. And I like to read her words verbatim because she was there that night, and I think you need to hear this from someone who speaks of what it was really like. So this is after she's been rescued by Carpathia. She's in New York City, recovering at a hospital. And she writes to that uncle that she was planning to see in the Chicago area. Dear Uncle, Titanic has gone down. I don't know whether my fiance and my brother Kurt are saved. Evidently they are not, for most of the men went under. I'm at a hospital, but I'm not sick, although very feeble. I have lost everything. I have no clothes, and so cannot get up, must lie in bed for present. And you think about that, I've lost everything. She's not kidding, because a lot of these folks, she was a second-class passenger, but she was not wealthy. And they didn't travel, folks just didn't have a lot of stuff in those days anyway, by and large, if you weren't uber wealthy. And so she probably had whatever she was bringing with her in a bag, which is now probably at the bottom of the North Atlantic. She probably has no money unless she would have had some in her pocket. She doesn't speak the language. She speaks Swedish in an English-speaking country. She must have just felt depressed beyond belief. And she talks about that. I would have been glad if I'd been permitted to die because life no longer has any value for me since I lost my beloved. I feel myself so dreadfully alone in this land. These people are certainly good, but nevertheless do not understand me. And this is something I always wondered, what was it really like when all this pandemonium is happening during that 2-hour, 40-minute window from impact to sinking? And she talks about it. I was in my berth when the Titanic hit the berg. I noticed the jar, and I soon heard Ingvar, her fiance, knocking on the door of her cabin. Get up, Dagmar, he said. The ship has hit something. So she was smart. She gets dressed. Some people went out on deck in their night clothes, which is a really bad move because Anybody from Iowa, we know how cold it can be in the middle of April, and it was cold that night on the sea. So she puts on a skirt and coat, hurries up on deck, but the officer said, go back, there's no danger. Go to your cabins. Now before we condemn the officers, we've got to think this through too. At this point, I don't know exactly what time this is happening, but this could be early on enough that even the crew and the captain aren't quite sure what's happened. They know something's happened, but they don't necessarily know how devastating it is. So the last thing we need is to have a bunch of panicked people freaking out on the ship, right? So that, I'm guessing, is the logic when he said go back. So she goes back to her berth, tries to go back to bed. Then there's more knocking on the door. Get up, Dagmar, we are in danger, Ingvar yelled. I don't care what the ship's officers say, the boat is sinking. And ironically, the people that kind of disregarded orders that night, more often than not, were the ones who were survivors. So she gets dressed again. They go running. She hears all this screaming and yelling. Now I'm guessing at this point we're pretty close to the end, because the screaming and yelling did not happen at midnight or 12:30, because at that point, it's still kind of a joke to a lot of people. The crew never really told everybody how serious it was. They didn't have an intercom system, so this is very haphazard. You know, maybe the stewards come knock on your door and say, you better get up and put on your life belt, but it's more just, it's a precautionary measure. And for some people, it's like, oh, honey, go get in the lifeboat, I'll see you at breakfast. They just didn't take it seriously, and I can see why. You're on the practically unsinkable ship, right? You've got Marconi wireless. It's dang cold outside, too. You know, it's much nicer in your heated cabin. And plus, before that ship really starts sinking, you're a long ways up on the boat deck. That is a long ways down to the ocean surface, and it's dark, other than the bright stars. I don't know that I'd really be too jazzed about getting in a lifeboat at that point either. So, but this, obviously, the things are going bad. I mean, the deck is tilting. When we're this far into the sinking, they know what's happening, and it's not going to be good. So, the two guys lead Dagmar to a lifeboat. Her fiance puts her in the lifeboat. She grabs his hand and does not want to let go. Come with me, she screamed as loud as she could, still holding his hand tight. So these life jackets, that's what they called life belts. They were basically just rectangles of cork with these canvas fabrics sewed around it. So ironically, those life belts, if you end up in the water, which by the way, the water is 28 degrees. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, water freezes at 32. Salt water does not. It can freeze at 28. And when I went to the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri, they have an exhibit with the lifeboats and with the water fountain. Have you been there? Yeah, and you can put your hand in that 28-degree water. And I thought, oh, I'm tough. I'm a farm girl from Iowa. This is going to be a piece of cake. I couldn't keep my hand under there 10 seconds before I was feeling serious pain. So I can't imagine how awful it was. So these poor people that end up in the water, they didn't drown most of the time. There were some drownings, but what killed most of them was hypothermia. And so all your life belt did was float your dead, lifeless body on the surface of the water. It was gruesome. It was awful. Now, not everybody had that experience. There were 700 some that made it into lifeboats. That's an actual picture of one of they're called that was a collapsible lifeboat. It's kind of a canvas boat that would fold up. There were about 4 of those. The rest were wooden lifeboats. But these poor folks that have been out there since anywhere from maybe 12:30 a.m. till at least 4:30 a.m. when Carpathia, the rescue ship, arrives. You're out there in these little boats. It's dark. Everyone's panicking. You hear all these screams around you of people in the water that are perishing. And you have no idea if anybody knows you're out there. You don't know if the Marconi man got the SOS. They called it CQD in those days, but SOS was the new distress signal. You don't know if they sent any of those. Or did those guys, who knows? We don't know. if you're in these little boats, no food, no water, you think, okay, are we just going to die out here in the ocean because no one will even know the boat sank? Or will we get sucked under? You know, before the Titanic actually made the final plunge, if we're too close, will it suck our lifeboat down with the big ship? Perilous times. Now, her boat, it wasn't until 6 a.m. when they were starting to get on the rescue ship, but she just was hysterical, like a lot of these women were. I never would have let them put me in that boat. If I would have known, I would have lost my brother and my fiance. She just was insistent, why didn't you let me die? I would have rather died with them. And so she returned home to Sweden, never did come to Red Oak, Iowa, for obvious reasons. Goes back home, marries a teacher named Eric Holmberg, and dies in 1969. Now, this family was already from the general Red Oak area, a little town called Stanton, if you've ever been to Stanton, Iowa. This is Swede country down in that part of Iowa. So Ernest Danbaum, he was a first-generation native-born Swedish-American. He was a farmer, and he was also an immigrant recruiter, which I find interesting. So when he would go back to the old country to visit family, some of these shipping companies would pay him a little bonus for all the immigrants that he could convince to come on these particular liners to come to America. So he was a recruiter, and he made some of his money that way. So when he and his wife, Anna, decided to go back to the old country to visit again, they were newlyweds, 1910. When people traveled in those days, sometimes they stayed a long time, which I found interesting. They stayed over there well over a year, as you can see, long enough that their first child was actually born in Sweden. But they're coming back to Iowa in April of 1912. The grandparents here in Red Oak, or the Red Oak area, I mean, were very excited to see little Gilbert, the brand new grandbaby they hadn't met before. And there were about a dozen, roughly a dozen. I've seen different numbers, but quite a sizable group coming with the Danbaums, traveling in third class. That's what a third class cabin looked like on Titanic. It doesn't look too fantastic by our standards. There would have been 4 bunks per cabin. But fear not, ladies, there would have been 1 bathtub down the hall for 700 women and 1 bathtub for 700 men. So obviously bathing was not quite up to the standards due to reasons with plumbing and whatnot. Today we think this was a big step backwards. This was actually a vast improvement in 1912. A lot of third-class passengers agreed that third class on Titanic was the equivalent of second class or almost first class on some of the previous ocean liners. So, sadly, none of them survived in this group, except one, a lady named Anna Nyston, who ended up settling in the Des Moines area. But the Danbaum family, the only body they were able to recover was Ernest's body. They never found Anna, they never found Gilbert. And if you go to the city cemetery in Stanton, Iowa, you can see Ernest's tombstone. His tombstone's interesting to me because of all the Iowa connections. His is the only one that actually denotes Titanic on the tombstone. A lot of the other people, they're just simple tombstones, you know, your name and your birth date, your death date, no indication you had any ties to Titanic. But his does note that, and it has the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." You even think about recovering a body in those days. This isn't as easy as it sounds, simply because how do you ID people that have no ID? Today we've all got driver's licenses or a social security card. We've got something that would usually be with us that, heaven forbid, if we're in an accident, the authorities could figure out who we were. Well, you didn't have that in 1912. So then when these 2 rescue ships go out to recover, this is when it becomes a recovery operation rather than trying to rescue survivors. They came up with about 300 some bodies was all. I can't imagine being on they were called death ships. They were actually transatlantic cable laying ships, because in those days you could send messages across the Atlantic thanks to these cables that literally spanned from North America to Europe. and these big ships would go out and lay those cables. Well, White Star Line paid for 2 of those ships to go out and recover dead bodies. So suddenly you don't just have cable on your ship, you've got coffins, you've got a Catholic priest, you've got a Protestant minister, you've got embalming fluid. That must have been the most gruesome detail for these guys that thought their job was just to lay cable on the floor of the ocean. But this Ernest, when they found him, they probably knew right away he wasn't first class, because he didn't have real fancy clothes. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or anything like that. And he was fairly easy to identify because he did have some paperwork in his pockets, had some money. You know, it's sad, that money he had, he was trying to help his family realize the dream of moving to Turlock, California to start a fruit farm, but that never happened. So that's the Danboms. Now, speaking of tuxedos, we're going to talk about a first-class family. We've talked about Iowans with third-class and second-class ties. Let's talk about first-class. So there's Walter Douglas. The Douglas family, how many of you are familiar with Bruce Moore, the big fancy mansion in Cedar Rapids? Okay, this is the Douglas family. He is an heir to that business, which was grain milling, corn milling. That's how they made their money. So they've been in Cedar Rapids many years. He's doing really great. You know, he's 50 years old. He had enough money at that point in his life he could retire. So he does. He's got this second wife named Mahala, also a Cedar Rapids native. That was kind of scandalous once again too, because there was a divorce. And then this Mahala, she was a classy gal, but she was quite scandalous in 1912 because she smoked. So these two had built a lavish home, which is still standing today up on Lake Minnetonka, which is southwest of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. It was prime real estate because in those days before air conditioning and it gets so hot, like today it's kind of hot and humid, right? Well, how great to be up on a nice lake, up at Lake Minnetonka. It's still a well-to-do area. And they lived in a part of the community called Deep Haven, and they built this mansion up there a few years earlier. And if you've got this kind of money, you don't go shopping for your furniture and stuff in Cedar Rapids. You go on the grand tour of Europe. And so that's what they did. They had been wintering in Europe, buying all kinds of stuff for the house. And then they get to come back on Titanic. And Walter's wife had her maid, Bertha Leroy was the woman's name. She was a French maid who was a full-time staff, one of many full-time staff for the Douglases. So usually if you were first class, there would be some rooms on that same level for the butlers and the maids and whatnot that would travel with these rich families. So they're coming back to celebrate his retirement. They'd just been in Cedar Rapids for Christmas 1911. Now, I'm not saying the Douglas' cabin was quite this elaborate, but this is what you could expect if you shelled out the big bucks. This is just a parlor in one of the first-class cabins. Obviously, there were bedrooms and other rooms, so very comfortable way to cross the sea. It was truly like being in a grand hotel. It just happened to be a floating hotel that would transport you across the sea. And of course, you had all your beautiful clothes, your fancy gowns, fur-trimmed collars on your coats. There's Bruce Moore over in Cedar Rapids, which you can still tour today. So what happened to Mahala and Walter? Well, the night of the sinking, Mahala gets in a lifeboat. If you're first class, your odds of getting in a lifeboat are pretty good, simply because, yes, they did cater to the well-to-do, but also their cabins were right up there by the boat deck. Whereas third class is way down below. It's just going to take you a lot longer to make it up to the boat deck. She, of course, wants her husband to get in the lifeboat. He says, no, I must be a gentleman. And he's got his tuxedo on from a dinner party they'd been at that night with other very well-to-do first-class passengers. So he was last seen helping women and children get into lifeboats. He does not survive. Mahala does survive. And we talked about that Des Moines Register and Tribune article with the fake news in it after the sinking. Well, in those days, if you're trying to get the fastest, hopefully most accurate news, you went to the telegraph office, which was generally connected somehow, some way to the newspaper office. And so the Douglas family, they had heard these bits and pieces that Titanic had sunk, and they're panicking, oh my gosh, did Walter and Mahala make it? What happened? And so they would just spend hours at the Cedar Rapids Republican newspaper hoping to hear word of anything. I can't imagine how awful that wait must have been. So, Titanic, this is a poem that Mahala wrote. She was kind of a patron of the arts, and I don't know exactly how long after the sinking she wrote this, but I'm sure it was therapeutic to write about what she remembered that night. You can see through the years, she had some very interesting, colorful costumes. She lived up there at Lake Minnetonka the rest of her life, never remarried. Her maid is down in that lower picture there. The family would also winter out in California, so that is one of their many homes. And Bertha Leroy is the lady right in the middle, the kind of blondish lady back there. She too survived the sinking. But I'll just read this poem to you. The sea, it's kind of hard for me to see on the screen. I might have to turn this way. The sea, velvet smooth, blue, black. The sky set thick with stars, unbelievably brilliant. The horizon a clean-cut circle. The air motionless, cold, cold as death. Boundless space. A small boat waiting in this vast stillness, waiting heartbreakingly, but in the offing a vast ship, light streaming from her portholes. Her prow on an incline. Darkness comes to her suddenly. The huge black hulk stands out in silhouette against the starlit sky. Suddenly the prow sinks deeper, as if some titan's hand, inexorable as fate, were downing the great ship to her death. Slowly, slowly, with hardly a ripple of that velvet sea, she sinks out of sight. Then that vast emptiness was suddenly rent with a terrifying sound. It rose like a column of heavy smoke. It was so strong, so imploring, so insistent, one thought it would even reach the throne of grace on high. But slowly, it lost its force, thinned to a tiny wisp of sound, then to a pitiful whisper, silence. Here we are, 110 years later, we're still, actually, what is it, 1912 to 1922? Yeah, still talking about Titanic. Why do we care? Do you ever wonder why we care so much about this shipwreck? It happened a long time ago. It certainly wasn't the worst shipwreck in terms of loss of life. And yet we can't let this story go, can we? Well, for a long time, it wasn't a story. Now it was, right after the sinking. It was big news. But then guess what comes along? 1914, World War I starts in Europe. Then we go through a bloody, god-awful World War I. Then the Great Depression comes along. Then World War II. Think of the loss of life in these events. It seems kind of silly to get too hung up on the shipwreck in 1912. But then in 1955, comes a game-changing book. It's called A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. Has anybody ever read A Night to Remember? Yeah, you know, he's a kid that came of age back in the 20s and 30s, and he remembered the glory days of these transatlantic ocean liners, and he was fascinated by them. He got to travel on Olympic, I believe, and he started thinking, you know, there's a lot of Titanic survivors still alive in 1955. I wonder if they'd talk to me about their experiences. And some did, like Mahala Douglas. And so he wrote this whole book, and it just caught the world's imagination. Then it leads to The Unsinkable Molly Brown, which was a stage play and a musical and also a film. So that was kind of based around Margaret Brown. She never called herself the Unsinkable Molly Brown. That's all Hollywood, but there was a real Margaret Brown from Denver. So that came along. You'd have, about every 10 years, there would be something, a book, a movie, something would reignite interest in Titanic. The biggest one probably was the '97 James Cameron movie, Titanic. And then Titanic 2, there's a rich gentleman that he's from Australia. He's been working on this a while. I don't know where it stands, but he's building Titanic 2, which is a carbon copy of Titanic. So if you got big bucks, you could pay to sail on Titanic 2 if they ever get this done. How many people want to sail on Titanic 2? When I talk to kids, they all raise their hand. Like, yeah, you're young, you don't know. There are some museums around, some various traveling displays if you want to actually see artifacts of Titanic. Before the pandemic, I went out to Washington, D.C. to the National Geographic Museum. That was a cool temporary exhibit. The Branson Museum, and that is actually the museum that looks like Titanic. I held off on going there because I thought, seriously, this can't be a legitimate scholarly museum in Branson. It's fantastic. Wonderful. And there's a sister museum down in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. So I haven't been to that one, but that one in Branson is good. And as a writer, I think about why, I think the reason we still care about Titanic is this has everything a human being could want in a story. We've got heroes, we've got villains, we've got honest people, we've got criminals, we've got people who were all about me and people who are all about self-sacrifice. And I think every one of us, as we hear these stories, we put ourselves in their shoes and say, what would I have done? Would I have been the hero? Would I have been a coward that night? How would I have reacted? We can kind of run the numbers and get a sense just from the data, would I have survived or not. So when Carpathia came to New York, there were roughly 713 survivors. If you were a woman, you had a good chance of survival, about a 3 in 4 chance. If you were a child, it was about 50-50. Men, good luck, because you only had a 20% chance of survival. First class, you got a pretty good odds. Second class, once again, roughly 50-50. Third class, not good, because about 75% of them perished. Even the Grand Staircase didn't survive when Cameron made his movie in '97. What it took to make that sinking scene look authentic actually destroyed this movie set when all the water gushed in. But I want you to notice the floor down there. You see the pretty patterns with the white and the black down below the stairs? What do you think that is? What flooring material was commonly used throughout the Titanic, actually, not just in that Grand Staircase area? Do you think it was marble, linoleum, or tile? That is a great guess, and it was actually linoleum. Linoleum was not new in 1912. It had been invented back in the 1860s. But think about this, and it makes sense once you understand. It's lightweight, right? Linoleum is light, and that counts on a ship. You don't want to be weighed down. They already had plenty of heavy stuff. So not only is this lightweight, but you can make any pattern you want. And so it was really having a design moment. So we kind of laugh about linoleum as being lowbrow, but it was good enough for Titanic. So my book is not done yet. This has been a very long project, but I hope to get this done by the end of the year. You know all the people on this book cover. We've met every last one of them, Mahala Douglas and the Caldwell family there in the middle, and the Danbaums on the right. And I would also like to point out, when the designer did that cover, that's not a stock picture of Titanic on the back. That was taken from a postcard that Albert Caldwell's great niece shared with me. That was a postcard of Titanic that was sent to Cedar Rapids. So there's significance behind everything on that cover. And when I was down at the museum in Branson, and you walk out and you find out whether you lived or died, you know, all those walls and names, and it's really emotional. And one of those boards, and actually maybe this was in Las Vegas. Would you believe a really good Titanic museum is in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas? But it is. And so you walk out the last phase of the museum, and you know, what's the best way to honor these people's memory? Because some people say, well, why are you still talking about that? And it's a depressing story in a lot of ways. Why do you keep talking about it? Well, for the reasons we said, and also we can honor this history, honor these people's memories. And the wall said, share their stories and tell their tales. And that's what we're doing today. So there's more stories to come. Like Jane mentioned, my next book coming out along with the Titanic one. October 10th is when the Lincoln Highway in Iowa comes out. So that will be fun. Stay tuned on that. And then all these other books I've got here today, all the ones I've written, So if you're into farming, if you're into food, I've got copies up here. The books run from about $24 to $28, depending on if they're softback or hardback, but that includes your tax. Just come see me, come talk. You don't have to buy a book. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them before we wrap up here. Yes?
Just a comment. I've been to one in Las Vegas and France, and I've been interested in this for a long time, and you made it feel like I was there. So thank you for you doing this in the library and this interest. You're excellent.
Like I told some of the audience earlier, it really troubles me when kids don't like history or anybody doesn't like it, because I said, what's the biggest part of the word history? It's story, right? Stories aren't boring. Yes?
I'm curious, in these days when they make ships, I think, there are compartments that close off, so if there is a problem, they can keep it from sinking. Was that not going on in those days? Or?
That is a great question. And so that's part of why Titanic had billed itself actually as the practically unsinkable ship, because it did have these 16 watertight compartments, and I believe it was even if 4 of them flooded, it could stay afloat. But if it got to 5, then you're in trouble. But what happened is, because they were trying to make more room on some of those promenade decks, once again, the bulkheads in those compartments didn't go all the way to the top like they needed them to. But nobody worried about it, because they thought, oh, the odds of these bulkheads ever filling up with water are so low, don't worry about it. But then when they hit that berg, we tend to think the ship crashed right into this berg and it ripped this huge 300-foot gash. That's not what happened. It scraped along this really big iceberg, and it essentially put all these little pinholes along for 300-some feet. But all that pressure kept pushing into these bulkheads, and one would fill up, the water would spill over into the next, and it just kept going like a domino till then you get too water heavy there in the bow, and that ship cannot stay upright. So if they had built the bulkheads to the top, this wouldn't have happened. So that's a great question. Yes?
You shared with us all the number of first, second, and third class passengers that survived, but there was a large crew on the Titanic. And as we know, all the top officers went down with the ship. How many crew actually survived? Because there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of crew members.
Yeah, and a few of the top officers did survive. There were about 5 or 6, but you're right. Captain Smith, Officer Murdoch, First Officer Murdoch all went down with the ship. So there was a handful of those guys, just like maybe 4 that survived. There were a few random stewards and stokers, the guys that would shovel the coal into the engines. But you're right, there were a tremendous number of crew. I think there were 700 some crew members at least on board, and the vast majority of them did not make it. And so towns like Southampton, England, which was a port of call for Titanic, that whole town depended on that. Most people, their livelihood was connected to the sea. A lot of these folks worked on ships like Titanic. It was devastating to a place like Southampton, England, because you just lost a third of your town in one disaster. So it's really interesting. There are books coming out now about the coal stokers and others like these crew members that you mentioned. It's fascinating to read those stories that have been untold for a long time. There's a book back here, I have it in my collection too, it's called Titanic Survivor. It's a stewardess named Violet Jessup who wrote her memoirs. She survived at least 2 sinkings during her career as a stewardess, including Titanic. So, wow, that woman was a survivor. And then the other quirky story, if you want to talk about the crew that was on board, there is a baker named Charles Jowan who, the guy survived. So we can't deny that all his story is false, but it seems too incredible to believe. But he was a baker, and he did help people get into the lifeboats, but apparently he'd been really boozing it up because, you know, hey, if I'm going to die, I at least want to be kind of out of my mind and drunk during the process. So he was full-blown intoxicated, And he wasn't in a lifeboat the whole time either, but somehow he managed to be out there in that water and not in a lifeboat all the time, and he survived.
And a freeze.
Right, right. So I think the lesson is if the ship's going down, get your hands on all the alcohol you can and drink a lot. Yes.
Is it true the band played Near My God to Thee as it was sinking?
That is a very hotly debated question. There are survivors' accounts that say at some point they played Nearer My God to Thee. There are other survivors that say they played a song called Autumn, which is basically the English spelling of a French song that was popular at the time called Song d'Automne. Most scholars seem to think it would have been quite unlikely that they would have spent a lot of time playing a hymn like that, because the band's job was to keep spirits up and to keep people happy and peppy and not thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. So it's one of those interesting things where, well, how come some survivors say, yes, that did happen, and others say, no, it didn't? It's the same reason that some accounts say that the ship broke in half, and other people said, no, it didn't. But we know that it did. When we found it 73 years later, it was most definitely broken in half. But, you know, this is such a huge ship. There's so much going on during those last minutes of pandemonium. I don't know that we'll ever know for sure with a definitive answer on some of these, whether things really did or didn't happen. But yeah, there's a big debate. Was it Nearer My God to Thee or Autumn? Good question. Yes?
Is it true that not all the lifeboats were full?
Yes. Yeah, actually the crew of the Carpathia was quite shocked when they started coming up onto some of these lifeboats at dawn, and some are not even half full. These boats were capable of holding usually 60 to 70 people, but some only had 12 people in them. But this goes back to what we talked about in those early phases of the lowering of the lifeboats. Well, this is a joke. I don't want to get in that boat, because what if this is kind of a false alarm? It's scary to go down that many feet in the dark. I just want to stay on the ship. So truly, the officers actually had trouble getting people to get in the lifeboats for about an hour. Yeah.
Where is the new Titanic 2 being built?
China. There you go, right? Yes.
Darcy, I've seen you've done a number of county histories. Have you ever had an idea to do one on Greene County? If we help you.
Well, you know, I always say, I'll never do another county book, because there's a lot of work. But I know you've got tremendous history here in Greene County. So if the people of Greene County think they'd ever like another history book, we can talk.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Well, very good. Any other questions? Yes.
I just watched the movie on Titanic over a week ago on TV. Some of what you talked about goes along with it.
Yeah.
Because a lot of sensationalism.
Yeah, you know, as a historian, that's why I don't like to read a lot of fiction, and I'm real leery about movies, because I always think, okay, how much sensationalism did you put in here just for the sake of a good story? Titanic needs no embellishment, by the way. Now, the interesting thing about that movie is James Cameron did make multiple dives to Titanic. He'd been there. And there was a lot in 1997 that we didn't know about Titanic that we do today because of subsequent dives. And I think it's National Geographic has a documentary about that, where they talked to Cameron 20 years later, and they asked him, what'd you get right, what did you get wrong? And you know, fortunately, most of it's pretty accurate. The biggest flaw, which is the whole driver of the movie though, is all about the love story between Jack and Rose, right? I can assure you that a first-class lady would have never come in contact with a third-class joker stowaway like Jack Dawson. Much less ran off with him. So, you know what's weird is up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, is one of the Titanic victims' cemeteries, because Halifax was the port that was closest to where we would take these bodies. And so there's hundreds of these Titanic graves out there, and Mom and I have been there. And ironically, there is a guy named Jack Dawson who was on Titanic, but he wasn't the Leonardo DiCaprio's character. He was a coal stoker, so about as nondescript and just no one cared about this poor guy. But now all these ladies that are fans of Leo's, they come to this grave, they think it's the Jack Dawson. There's flowers and tributes all over this grave. So that Jack is way more famous in death than he ever was in life. Yes?
Were any of the families compensated by the shipping line?
That is a great question too. Just like today, when there's a big disaster, we mourn the victims and then we start suing, right? They tried that in 1912 and 1913, 1914, in that time period. Actually, to precede that, within weeks, like within a week or two or three of the sinking, there were hearings. The U.S. Congress had hearings over here. The British had their own set of hearings in London. And essentially, White Star Line, I guess, had good enough lawyers that basically it's like, well, this was an act of God. No one could have prevented this, even though they had multiple warnings of icebergs and they were speeding into a known ice region. So I don't think it was an act of God, but basically we didn't have enough evidence to say, oh yes, White Star Line was at fault. So people like, there was a first-class passenger named Charlotte Cardeza. She had claims for, I don't know, just off the charts. It'd be millions of dollars of claims today of all her stuff that went down with the ship, all the way to third-class people trying to get little, whatever pittance they could get. Basically, no, these people got hardly anything from lawsuits. Now, there were a bunch of fundraisers after the disaster. Baseball was big at this time, and so I believe it was the New York Yankees that had a fundraiser game where all the proceeds went to the survivors. The Red Cross and groups like that took up charitable donations for the survivors. So some folks got a little bit, but nobody got much. And you know, the worst insult, talking about the band, those guys were not considered White Star Line or Titanic employees. They were contract workers, because then the shipping companies could pay them less. And so not only were these guys entitled to no types of funds from the shipping line after this disaster, but to add insult to injury, within a few weeks of the sinking, they sent letters to these victims' families saying, oh, by the way, you owe us for the uniform and stuff that your loved one wore in the vehicle. So I always say, you know, times change, technology changes, but sadly, some parts of human nature don't change. So. Yes? Omar.
O-M-A-R.
Okay.
The Titanic and the jewels and the treasures right now.
Oh, okay, okay. That's I have not read that book, but I'm guessing it's talking about that bejeweled, the Rubaiyat, I think the book was called. It was a very expensive book, and it went down with the ship. Yes, I'll have to check that out. Any other questions? Yes?
Who was the last survivor?
Her name was Melvina Dean, and she died, I believe, in 2009. She was a British lady, and she was, oh boy, like maybe 6 weeks old, I think, on Titanic. And she liked the attention. I mean, she enjoyed talking about Titanic. So if you look up Melvina Dean, there are lots of stories about her, and she seemed like a very pleasant, happy lady and had a very nice life. So it's really not all that long since the very last Titanic survivor left us. Well, you folks have had great questions. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much.